Hi, everybody. I'm Deborah Kotz. I'm the Senior Director of Media Relations at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. And I'm here with my colleagues at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. And they encompass the School of Nursing, Pharmacy, and Dentistry, among others. We want to thank you for joining us today for our panel discussion on the future of federally funded research, the promise and the peril. And as I said before, we are recording this Zoom presentation. We will have it available to you after the presentation. We'll have it posted probably to our YouTube channel. If there's anything that you missed that you need to get for your purposes, we can have that available. We can also arrange for one-on-one interviews with you if you need. After the panel discussion, you can reach out to me directly and I can work to make that happen. And now I'd like to introduce Dean Mark Gladwin, who will make the opening remarks. Dr. Mark Gladwin is the Dean of the University of Maryland School of Medicine, and he's the Vice President for Medical Affairs at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. Thank you, Dean Gladwin, for joining us today.
Great. Thank you so much. I think the most important thing that you'll hear today are the stories from our faculty and scientists. But I just want to start by saying that one of the great treasures of America are its academic medical centers. And if you think about every city in America, there's an academic medical center that drives that local economy. And in fact, in most cities, we've really lost manufacturing, but we have our med ed cities. And, I spent 13 years at Pittsburgh, which went from steel to a med ed city with University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, University of Pittsburgh, Carnegie Mellon. And it's transformed that city. And we see the same thing right in Baltimore, where we have Johns Hopkins University and the University of Maryland, Baltimore, which, combined have more than $2 billion in research that fuels the economies of those cities. And, academic medical centers are one of the prized products of America. And if you think about it, this, data from AMC, there's only 5% of all hospitals in America are academic medical centers, like Johns Hopkins and the University of Maryland Medical Center, where we work. But those 5% of hospitals take care of 30% of the underserved, more than 20% of Medicare patients, almost 30% of Medicaid patients. We train 70% of all health professionals, residents, nurses, medical students. So we're the pipeline for the future of health and science, and we perform 60% of NIH-sponsored research. And if you look at my budget in the School of Medicine, it's half clinical and half research. So that research funding is essential for the mission, and we live off a 2% margin. I like to tell people each iPhone is a 60% margin. But the most important thing we do in this country at academic medical centers is sustained by a 2% margin. And that NIH investment has been one of the great success stories of America. Since World War II, the NIH has had broad and sustained bipartisan support. In fact, the NIH was started by Eisenhower. The NCI was started by Richard Nixon. The initial doubling of the NIH was George Herbert Walker Bush. And we now know today that for every dollar of NIH funding, there's more than $2.5 in economic impact. And those academic medical centers, those 5% that I mentioned, we support almost 4% of all jobs in America, and they're the great jobs. These aren't service sector working Pizza Hut jobs, which I did when I was, young. These are the jobs, nurses, medical assistants, doctors. These are the great jobs that drive the economy of our cities. And the deliverable is incredible. Not only do we have among the best, most advanced and innovative medical care in the world, but our research is driving the success of America. Since an amazing statistic, since 2010, between 2010 and 2019, during what I've seen is a revolution in drug development, a dizzying revolution in science. Every single one of the FDA-approved drugs it sort of was birthed from NIH funding. So if you think about all the biologics, which are antibodies targeting immune checkpoint inhibitors for cancer. You think about genetically engineered T cells, CAR T cells. You think about gene editing. You think about, these antibodies are targeting inflammation for almost every disease, from multiple sclerosis to dermatologic conditions. These antibodies are targeting cancer pathways and curing cancers for the first time. So this revolution has been driven by NIH funding. And from classic cardiovascular drugs, from the statins, all the way now to the miracle of the SGLT2 inhibitors and the GL1 inhibitors for obesity, all came from NIH research. In terms of our local climate, the University of Maryland School of Medicine, we have about $540 million in total grants, but our portfolio is about half NIH funding. And we have been very successful. This year, we submitted almost 30% more grants than we normally have. That's $258 million in grants. And we have nearly 60 million grants right now, this year alone, that have fundable scores that are on hold. And what we've seen is grants are either not being reviewed or not being awarded. In fact, the NIH has awarded $2.8 billion less in funding as of today than the same time last year. So we're seeing only about 30% of grant renewals, new grants have been funded compared to last year. So this wave of underfunding is hitting us. And that's independent of this battle over indirects. And for us, for example, if we were to take our indirect rate from 55% down to 15%, that would be $37.5 million of our budget. The state only supports our School of Medicine with a $540 million budget portfolio, about $80 million. So you can imagine that hit of $37.5 million. And those indirects, again, that equation has existed since World War II. And the idea is you use directs for things like salaries, cost of reagents, the real cost of doing the experiments. But the indirects were always designed for that overhead: rent, power, radiation safety, human subjects protections, the protection of animals, the welfare of animals in research, ensuring that we have proper anesthesia and humane treatment. So those indirects have a vital role in the safe and successful management of our research operations. So anyway, I just want to, what I'm terrified about is we're already seeing that these grants not being renewed are resulting in dropping support for our investigators. Not only is their mission stalled, whether it's, clinical cares, you're going to hear best from our faculty. So their mission is stalled, but they're also not hiring people. They're having to lay off teams of people. And what's the most worrying is we're all having to now cut on grad students, PhD students going into science. So we normally would offer 50 slots, and we've cut that down to 30. We're trying to add a few more just because we're trying to do our part, but almost every university is either cutting or freezing grad students. And we're now hearing from our scientists, even if we have the grad students, they can't afford to take them in the lab. So I think we're going to see, from the basic PhD students to the postdoctoral students to the faculty, we're going to just see a rapid shockwave to our ability to continue research, which again has distinguished America and driven our economy. So I'll just stop there, and I don't know if there's questions, or do we go to our next speaker? What's the plan?
Well, I think we can go to our next speaker now, but although I will say that if there are journalists who do have questions, we can follow up with them and connect you with them one-on-one afterward. Sure. There will be time. I realize that you're busy and you're at our conference right now, so there will be time for questions for the other panelists after as well. So okay. Great. Thanks for joining, Dean. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Great. So now I would like to introduce Dr. Wilbur Chen. He is a professor of medicine at the University of Maryland School of Medicine Center for Vaccine Development and Global Health. Dr. Chen does a lot of vaccine research, and he's also previously served on the CDC's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices.
Well, thank you for having me today, and hopefully I'll be able to field some important questions from our colleagues today. So I'm a professor of medicine. I'm also the chief of the Division of Geographic Medicine in the Department of Medicine. Geographic medicine has had many different names over the years. So some people in other universities call it international medicine or maybe tropical medicine. I also am the chief of adult clinical studies at the Center for Vaccine Development and Global Health. It's an organized research center within the School of Medicine. And I mentioned this because, again, as kind of the focus of government-funded research, this center has been in existence for about 50 years. Initially, we were started by being tasked with trying to tackle diarrheal diseases. And in fact, there were people that were seconded by from the CDC to come here to the University of Maryland to study and research diarrheal diseases. These are diseases that are associated with poor access to clean water, sanitation, and hygiene. So you can imagine that these are predominantly of developing country settings. So importantly, over the past 50 years, government funding has been fundamental to our mission. Diarrheal disease is not a typical big pharma focus. As you can imagine, it's not, trying to target a condition of impoverished countries throughout the world is not a moneymaker. So it's the NIH, the CDC, the DoD that has traditionally supported our research, which is super important for global health. The only US cholera vaccine that's available right now that was licensed since 2016 was invented by our center with NIH research dollars. The licensure enabling clinical trials have funded my colleagues and us for doing all of that. I'm currently funded by the NIH to develop newer vaccines and vaccine candidates for Shigella and enterotoxigenic E. coli, which are also diarrheal diseases. We also have programs trying to address vaccines for norovirus, which again comes to the fore all the time. Right now, it's disrupting more cruise ships. We also have a vaccine that we're developing against salmonella, which is among one of the most common foodborne illnesses in the US. You hear about non-typhoidal salmonella infections with a lot of our food crops and other imported items that we have. These are all research programs that are heavily reliant on government funding. My center, not myself, but other colleagues at my center tackle malaria, dengue, respiratory viruses. We were at the front of the COVID-19 effort. Emerging infections, we were at the front of Ebola and responding to it in West Africa in 2014. We also have programs addressing multiple antibiotic-resistant organisms, and we have funding to make vaccines against those as well. All of this is heavily reliant on government funding. I'll just mention that the US is right now really reliant on international trade. We have very easy international travel. We have changes in climate throughout the world. And all of these suggest that, the global health problems that we see around the world can quickly become local US problems. So, dramatic reductions in government support for global health programs can be expected to cripple our ability to act in the future. So that was kind of all I wanted to start with this discussion today. Thank you.
Great. And I would like to, Dr. Chen, I know that there may be some journalists with vaccine questions. So I would like to give people an opportunity just for a few questions. We'll also have more questions at the end because we do have a number of people presenting. But if anyone has any questions related specifically to vaccines, immunization programs, if you want to unmute yourself or put the question in the chat, feel free, and I'll just give you guys a few seconds, and if not, we'll move on. Okay.
Deb, can I ask a quick question about vaccines?
Sure.
Dr. Chen, hi.
Can you, introduce where you're from, Fran? Thanks.
Hi, I'm Fran Kritz. I have a question. I did a story last week for NPR on the cuts to Gavi. So I guess one question I have to ask is, even though this conversation today is about what will happen with the loss of global funding, my question for you is, are you also at this time thinking about what you will do if the cuts aren't all restored or aren't restored? And I know that that's a big question, but I mean, is there also some thought about what other alternatives are if short-term or even long-term, some or all of the funding that you need for vaccine development in particular is not restored?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. And the simple answer is because we don't know what's happening right now and what decisions are going to be made in the next few days, weeks, months, or even few years, we don't know how crippling the conditions will be. But right now, I think, I have a lot of colleagues at the WHO in which they are really trying to retract a lot of their global health efforts because they just have to maintain some of their most important programs. They may have, say, for example, 20 different programs that they've traditionally tried to support through their own offices, and now they have to pick their top 3 to try to continue to maintain to support. And what happens to those other 17? They kind of fall off and are not addressed. Gavi, that Gavi support, I think the US provides 10% traditionally of the Gavi support. The countries I work in,
it was about to be 15%.
Yeah. So it's a significant number. And I work in a lot of those Gavi eligible countries, and Mali and specifically, is a Gavi country that is trying to get a new meningococcal vaccine that we helped develop. And they're trying to submit that this year. I don't know what will happen when Gavi, support drops off. Their ability to co-fund and make these vaccines available for these countries is going to be crippled. So again, vaccines might be available for the rich, but for the poor, it will become increasingly less available, and that is certainly a problem.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just maybe add from our internal university strategy. The Center for Vaccine Development is it's a national treasure. Not only were they top enrollers in COVID vaccine trials, but they also have laboratory programs that are pre-exposure vaccinations, so they can try an experimental vaccine with willing volunteers and then expose them to an infectious agent that's where there's a known potential treatment, so that they can ensure the safety of the volunteer, but then rapidly prove with this exposure that the vaccine works. And these kind of exposure studies are going to be critical as new pathogens emerge. And so these kind of programs, are really dependent on, because they're high risk, they're really dependent on grants. So one thing we're thinking about, for example, we're moving to try to accelerate our time to clinical trials activation and try to spread the word that we could become a platform partner for foundations or even industry, that could we bridge this capacity as a platform partner? Because again, industry has largely divested its own research operation and depends on NIH-funded academic medical centers to execute their trials. And so this incredible partnership to lead to all these drugs and successful vaccines for COVID requires this industry-university partnership. So we're thinking about things like that, but you can imagine everybody needs that help. And so I think everyone's a bit overwhelmed in terms of their capacity. I'm going to have to jump off soon, but I just do want to thank everybody on this call that the free press is one of the great things of this country. And I'm really just proud and appreciative of everything you do. And I really appreciate the time you're taking to understand indirects and understand the scientific and academic medical center enterprise. So, I just, we're cheering you on and appreciate you. And thanks for everything you do every day.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Dean Gladwin. And thanks, Fran. Well, we will move on. And we'll have more time for questions at the end as well. So now I'd like to introduce Dr. Sarah Kattakuzhy. She's an associate professor of medicine at the Institute of Human Virology at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. She's also the associate director of the Collard Institute for Addiction Medicine.
Thank you all so much. Thank you again for your time. Just want to echo that. So I just want to share my perspective. As Deb mentioned, my specialty is in the overlap of addictions and associated infections, which unfortunately individuals with substance use disorder disproportionately receive. I'm also a practicing addiction medicine specialist. So I want to speak to you from both my hats as someone who sees people affected by substance use disorders in our region, but also as a scientist desperately trying to seek better solutions for these individuals. Okay, so, despite thanks to the amazing reporting from you all, we do understand that we've had a modest decline in overdose deaths, both nationally and especially very proudly here in Baltimore and our state of Maryland. However, we remain in the midst of drug overdose death crisis. And one aspect of the current crisis that I think is overlooked, but very important, is that while deaths from synthetic opioids like fentanyl are still the primary driver of death, what we're experiencing now is the modern fourth wave of the overdose death crisis, and that's really polysubstance use, in particular, fentanyl combined with stimulants. And that's the red line that you can see here that unfortunately has not yet reached its peak. Stimulants include drugs such as methamphetamines or cocaine, and despite the challenges associated with use of these drugs and their increasing prominence, there are no FDA-approved medications to treat either of these disorders. And this is particularly challenging because of the cohorts that I see and that our group sees here in Baltimore or in Washington, D.C., about 50% of people use cocaine alongside their opioids. So this challenge of stimulant use disorder is both a regional challenge for us here, but it's also timely, it's prescient, it's right now. So the good news is that in the last several years, really the last decade, driven by federal funding from the National Institute of Drug Abuse, science has exploded in its therapeutic evaluations of possible treatments across the spectrum of substance use disorders. As was mentioned, one of the most remarkable areas of science that's happened in the last several years has been the advent of new medications for obesity and diabetes called GLP-1 agonists. And these are under trade names such as Wegovy or Ozempic. So in addition to the incredible effects that we've seen on weight loss and on sugar control, there's emerging science that's showing that these drugs may have an effect on impulse control, on decision-making, and on a so-called anti-hedonic effect that may have implications in substance use disorders. And they're currently being explored around the globe, particularly in alcohol use. And our group is really privileged. We are at the cusp of launching a clinical trial evaluating the safety and tolerability of semaglutide for people with cocaine use disorder. And this will be the first trial in the world exploring this. Again, reiterating that people with cocaine use disorder have no viable therapeutic options right now. And so this is just a schematic of the overall study, but the important takeaway is that we want to explore to see if, number one, this is safe, and number two, if this is efficacious at reducing drug use in people with cocaine use disorder. And I just want to step back and say this is where a lot of this work will be conducted. I'm privileged to be a scientist at the Institute of Human Virology, which is, again, one of our institutes at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. This is our clinical research unit. It's spaces like these that are what indirects support. So my patients who have substance use disorders, who by and large have really been mistreated by the medical system, can come into a clean space. They can be greeted. They can have their weight and blood pressure checked to make sure what's happening to them is safe. They have a nurse that will evaluate them and make sure they're not experiencing adverse effects. And all of this is done in a space that I, as a scientist, can go that's ready for me, that I know will have working lights and toilet paper and a phlebotomist who knows how to draw blood from people who use drugs. So this is science in action. It is extremely critical. It comes down to these nitty-gritties of how you're going to get people in the building and how we're able to make these giant leaps in science. It really starts with the support from the university level. So with that, I'll stop and happy to answer any questions or defer.
Great. And just one thing I wanted to note, that the Clinical Research Center is something that is funded by indirect costs when it's not in use and direct costs when it is in use. Is that correct, Sarah? Dr. Kattakuzhy? Yeah.
So for Institute of Human Virology researchers, I do not have to budget for that space in my direct costs. That comes to me as part of the indirect support in the investigators. There are particular individuals who are working within the CRU that direct funds may support, but the space itself really comes to me as a scientist.
All right. Well, thanks, Dr. Kattakuzhy. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Man-Kyo Chung. He is a professor of pain and neurosciences at the University of Maryland School of Dentistry. He's also the co-director of the University of Maryland Center for Advanced Chronic Pain Research.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. My name is Man-Kyo Chung. I'm a professor at the School of Dentistry, Department of Neural and Pain Sciences. And I'm also the co-director of Center to Advance Chronic Pain Research. So as a co-director, I want to emphasize how much this NIH grant has been critical for chronic pain research in our campus. So chronic pain is a major medical problem, as you know. Either ourselves or our friends or our family suffer from this chronic pain every day. This incurs huge amount of social cost. So it's critical to develop a novel way to treat this chronic pain and understand this chronic pain better, and also develop to better manage this patient population. So myself is interested in temporomandibular joint disorder, which is a jaw pain, and also nerve injury-induced chronic pain. And also our colleagues are working with migraine headache, chemotherapy-induced pain, low back pain, gut pain, etc. So this is a summary of about more than 20 projects that is currently or recently supported by NIH. And all the PIs have been working in different areas, such as mechanistic study or patient-based study or developing a novel treatment. So mechanistic study is a huge portfolio in our center. So we are asking some important questions, such as why aged female with high stress suffer more chronic pain than others. And also the patient-based study has been asking what is the critical factor determining this acute injury produce some chronic pain down the road, which allow us to provide more individually tailored pain treatment. And also this NIH study allow us to develop this pain management guidelines, which can be implemented in nursing home setting, where a lot of chronic pain patients live. And also our investigators have been developing novel non-opioid treatment for chronic pain. For example, we have identified several novel analgesic targets for treating migraine headache or post-traumatic, post-surgical chronic pain. Also, an investigator is validating yeast-derived antibody therapy for treating some gut pain. And also our lab is interested in vagus nerve stimulation to alleviate temporomandibular disorder pain. And virtual reality is also a novel therapy being tested in temporomandibular disorder pain. So all these studies are broadly beneficial, not only to reduce this chronic pain suffering, but also it's going to reduce the usage of the opioid-based drug that eventually leads to a reduction of the addiction. So most of these studies were funded by NIH, and we all of us really appreciate, and hopefully this funding can continue, but we already begin to be affected by this funding cut. For example, the study related with the sex difference on orofacial pain was terminated because of the gender ideology issue. So that study is actually the animal study, which doesn't really have gender ideology issue, but that was screened by keyword-based search, and that study was terminated, and we are now preparing for an appeal procedure. So I'm gonna, if you are interested in any of these individual study, I'm gonna elaborate more, or I'm going to happy to connect with the individual working on these studies. And we are now all very appreciate this strong federal support, and hopefully this pain program can be continued. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cheng. Does anyone have any questions?
Hi, this is Nina Agarwal. I have a question. Just you mentioned undertaking an appeal process for the termination of the grant. I wonder if you can talk a little more about that.
Yes, so we believe that the grant is not really dealing with any gender ideology. Rather than that, the grant is about the biological sex difference of the chronic pain. So we are trying to argue that point, and we try to appeal about the wrong decision. So we are now working with the University Council to draft the appeal letter, and we are going to submit that soon.
Yeah, I would just add is we've just started that process. We haven't gotten feedback, but we're hopeful. The case is certainly very strong on this grant.
Jim, do you want to give your title?
Oh, I'm sorry.
No.
Yeah. Jim Hughes, I'm a Senior Vice President and oversee the Office of Research and Development, and it's our office that's working on the appeal of this grant and several other terminations that we've gotten in the last couple of weeks.
And that's at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. It could be a little confusing. Yes.
University of Maryland, Baltimore. So we work with the researchers at all the UMB schools. Usually submitting grants, but now we've gotten in the business of appealing terminations.
And Jim, thanks for being on as well. So I think we'll move on to the next presenter if there are no other questions for Dr. Cheng, but we will come back to you at the end if reporters have further questions about the state of our grants and how we're appealing. I think that's a great topic. All right. Great. And now I would like to introduce Dr. Stuart Martin. He is the Deputy Director of the Marlene and Stuart Grenenbaum Comprehensive Cancer Center. He's also the Interim Chair of the Department of Pharmacology and Physiology at our School of Medicine.
All right, thank you very much, Deborah. And I'd like to reiterate the thanks for the media who are joining us here today to learn more about these processes and really sort of participate in all of this with us. As Deborah mentioned, I'm the Deputy Director of the Greenbaum Comprehensive Cancer Center here. I'm also the chair of the Department of Pharmacology and Physiology that has a dedicated division to develop new cancer therapeutics. And so that's something that at a comprehensive cancer center, it involves the merging of both the research and clinical trials. And here at the Greenbaum Comprehensive Cancer Center, we've treated nearly 200,000 Maryland residents for cancer and undertake at this current time more than 250 active clinical trials. And so this is bringing experimental medications to cancer patients across the country, because our cancer center is one of a network of cancer centers across the country that are undertaking these clinical trials that involve the medications that are developed from the research that's funded by NIH grants in many cases. And so that's bringing medications to patients, in many cases could be their last hope for survival from cancer. And so that's the other part of this that we need to think about, is the research that's supporting clinical trials. Now, I'll share just a couple quick slides to emphasize sort of the progress that we've made with cancer, but also the importance of a stable infrastructure for continuing innovation in these areas. So research has certainly improved cancer treatment in the United States. If we look at the annual cases of cancer in America in 2024, there were 2 million cases of cancer and nearly 600,000 deaths. Now, there has been substantial progress since about 1990. We've seen that the cancer death rate for both men and women has decreased nearly 33%. And this reduced death rate has saved more than 4 million lives, if you project that forward. Now, how did this come about? A lot of this actually depends on NIH research, and I'll just give one example here. If we look at the cost to sequence an entire human genome, when this was done by the Human Genome Project, funded by the George H.W. Bush administration, the first human genome took 13 years to sequence and cost nearly $300 million. At the current time, because of the advances of the Human Genome Project, the infrastructure that was built, and then the innovations through partnerships of academic institutions and industry have shortened this tremendously. So now an entire human genome can be sequenced in one day for less than $1,000. Okay, so that was an important structural stability that was provided by the NIH. And how does that impact cancer treatment today? This is just one example. There's a new technology called liquid biopsy, which is using blood tests to detect cancer, determine the best drugs to use, and monitor how the patients respond. So this is essentially a blood test for cancer that can detect cancer more than 1 year before imaging scans. But this technology is entirely based on the sequencing innovations developed by the Human Genome Project by sequencing mutated DNA shed by the tumor into the bloodstream. And so it was made possible by the Human Genome Project and NIH research, but is now the current focus of numerous multi-billion-dollar companies that are developing liquid biopsies based on this human genome data. And so then just looking forward at where this takes us even further, another good example of that is the C-Bioportal database for cancer genomics. This now has the complete genomes of patient tumors from 318,000 patients. That is a platform for new drug discovery, for precision medicine that's targeted to individual patients, and is also now a rich resource for artificial intelligence analysis for new ideas on how to solve cancer, using the sequence information from these 300,000 patients. And this was started at an academic cancer center, reported back in 2012 by the Memorial Sloan Kettering Comprehensive Cancer Center, but was supported by grants from NCI, NCRR, and NIGMS, but then has been continued to be built since 2012 by the network of comprehensive cancer centers, including ours, to get the data on these 300,000 patients. And so those are the things that are really going to make the difference in cancer treatment going forward. Cancer is a disease that affects many American citizens' lives and impacts many families. And research is really the only way to make progress and improve the treatment of cancer. And just in closing, I think that innovation is something that America has done particularly well here, as epitomized by the NIH. And just to share a couple last things here, I think in terms of the Nobel Prizes awarded for physiology or medicine, it's clear that the United States outstrips many others because of this investment in research that's been made over many decades. And this is also reflected in the business outcomes with the value share of the worldwide pharmaceutical market, which is also dominated by the United States, but based on this stable foundation of NIH funding from which we can make the discoveries and undertake the clinical trials to really help patients. So I'll stop there, but I'd be happy to take any questions.
Hi there, my name's Sarah Manusco with CBS News. You mentioned that there's more than 250 active clinical trials happening right now to help patients get treatment. Are any of those expected to be disrupted due to the recent cuts and changes? Have any patients already been impacted, or are we kind of looking towards the future to see how things will be impacted in terms of research then being developed into medicine?
Yes, thanks very much, Sarah, for your question. So as I mentioned, a number of the clinical trials are including experimental medications that were developed from the research. So with the disruptions that we're seeing in research, that will also disrupt those trials. And so that would be the case not only at our center, but at the other cancer centers nationwide.
Thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions for Dr. Martin?
And I'll stay on that to answer questions at the end too.
All right, well, now I'd like to introduce Dr. Ian Kleckner. He is an associate professor and director of the Synapse Center at the University of Maryland School of Nursing.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Great. Yep. So again, thanks everybody for being here and helping to spread the good news about what we're doing and why it's so important to continue this type of research. Today, I'm going to tell you about the importance of preventing, treating, and understanding symptoms that patients have from their cancer and its treatment. But before I get into it, I'm going to start with some easy questions. Can you feel the ground beneath your feet? Can you feel the phone in your hand when you text your friends? It's really easy to take those kind of feelings for granted, but for the 40% of Americans that are diagnosed with cancer, their relationship with their body changes. One patient on my study told me, since my chemotherapy, I became very sensitive to how my body reacted to different things. Like it's my job to know these things now instead of ignoring them. For example, a headache, which would have otherwise ignored, I want to pay attention to. So for example, chemotherapy can cause nerve damage or neuropathy in over half of patients. And that neuropathy causes numbness, tingling, pain in the hands and feet, which make it hard to walk, maintain balance, increases risk of falls, makes it hard to use a phone, button your clothes, text your friends on your phone, write with a pen. Neuropathy can also give cause to stop life-saving chemotherapy because we don't know how to prevent or treat it well enough. And if we don't stop the chemo, neuropathy can last for years or a lifetime. In other cases, sensations in the gut that used to be experienced as hunger can now be experienced as nausea or anxiety or worry. Sensations that used to be tiredness can now become debilitating fatigue that is so bad that patients can't even fathom to open a can of soup to feed themselves. And that is a paraphrase from another one of the patients on my study. How can we help patients with cancer prevent, treat, and manage their symptoms? 10 years ago, I founded my lab, which is called the Cancer Control Mind and Body Lab. And our job is to understand how the body and brain produces those subjective feelings, those symptoms, and to translate that knowledge into treatments that help patients with cancer feel better. In that time, we've opened 6 clinical studies, including 4 randomized clinical trials testing the effects of exercise, with over 250 patients with cancer, supported by 5 grants from the NIH and 1 grant from the American Cancer Society. So far, our results have showed us that exercise during the weeks of chemotherapy can reduce the intensity of neuropathy symptoms. Exercise may reduce how much those symptoms interfere with daily activities, even if the intensity of the symptom doesn't change. The symptoms are less interfering with exercise. And exercise can promote adaptive beliefs about the symptoms that patients have, helping them worry less about them and feeling a sense of empowerment. We also do imaging of the brain with functional MRI, and we found that exercise can change the functional connectivity within the brain, which is related to how different regions in the brain communicate with each other. So it's one thing to say, yeah, keep moving, exercise is great, everybody should exercise. But exercise science is about understanding the dose that is required to improve health. And we can dose exercise just like we dose medications. The frequency, intensity, time, and type. We can figure out how little exercise you need to experience relief. Wouldn't everyone like to know that? We can figure out how we can tailor exercise to each patient making it work best for them, and support people to exercise enough to get that benefit. And we know a lot about how exercise strengthens the body, but we're just scratching the surface on how exercise can strengthen the mind. One patient on one of my studies said, related to the exercise intervention, "You got me through some tough times and helped me get up and move even when I didn't want to." But of course, research is about more than helping people one at a time. Research is about improving the standard of care for billions of people, not just one, for everyone. So when someone you love gets a diagnosis of cancer, you know that when they go to the cancer center, they are getting the best care possible. So your doctor doesn't have to tell you, "I'm sorry, we don't know what to do for your mom or dad or son or friend." If our work can continue in the coming decades, what you're going to see is new tests and new treatments that are better than what we have today. You're going to go in the clinic and see things that you have never thought of and see things that you didn't think were even possible, not just with new drugs or devices, but also with behavioral programs like exercise, diet, psychological therapies, and combination therapies. Right now, we are on the brink of transforming symptom management for patients with cancer, but we need continued funding and federal support to make that possible. Thanks.
Thanks, Dr. Kleckner. Anyone have any questions for Dr. Kleckner about his research or how things are going?
Hi, this is Marina Koff from NBC News. You mentioned, I believe your work is funded by 5 NIH grants. Have any of them been terminated or kind of in a limbo type period?
So I'm in the fortunate position that my grants are still ongoing, and so we've continued as usual.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay. Well, now I'd like to introduce Dr. Audra Stinchcomb. She is a professor of pharmaceutical sciences at the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy.
So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today from the media. I know there's a lot of different things going on, and this is a very important one to all of us and all the patients that have already been discussed. So thank you. So I work in the School of Pharmacy, and primarily I work on drug delivery. And so what I do in the School of Pharmacy is I try to make drugs go through the skin more quickly. And then I also measure things that go through the skin that we don't want to go through the skin. Like, for example, we have done studies in tobacco farm workers and the nicotine that's absorbed through their skin at toxic levels in the tobacco farming and tobacco picking industry. And also, if drugs won't go through the skin fast enough to make a drug, then we find ways to do that. And so that is what we are primarily doing at the School of Pharmacy. So we work on all sorts of different dosage forms, gels, and patches, as you can see, and creams, ointments, sticks, foams, anything that you can deliver a drug from to the skin. Also, if we can't get a drug to go through the skin quickly enough, we actually change its chemistry so it can go through the skin more quickly and deliver the drug. And if all these types of strategies fail, then we end up poking holes in the skin at the bottom panel here. We make tiny micropores in the skin with these microneedle systems, and we look at ways to increase the drug delivery through those. So they create tiny invisible pores in the skin and deliver the drugs over 3 to 7 days from a patch system. When I was asked about, what did I think federal funding was most important for me, as an entrepreneur, I think about the small businesses that I've supported over the years, the last 20 years with NIH funding. So my first company worked on pain and nausea treatments primarily for cancer chemotherapy patients. And we started that company in 2004 and sold it in 2014. And so besides university research, a lot of professors have startup companies, and they are very highly supported in the university environment. We have our nice biopark that you see across the street and other facilities in town as well. And that is also another place where we create drug products. So after that company was sold, I started another company, and we had FDA funding to work on pain treatments. And we also worked on abuse-resistant pain treatments. So like you heard about fentanyl abuse earlier, fentanyl patches are highly abused. And so we worked on different ways so that it was not possible for people to abuse fentanyl patches. And then just last year, I started working on a third company, and we are hoping to get NIH funding to develop heart disease prevention treatments and heart disease treatments. So I have relied on the past very heavily on the NIH funding to move these products forward. And I was hoping to start writing quite a few more grants to support that. The NIH has a very robust small business funding mechanism, and I think a lot of us take advantage of that to help develop drugs that wouldn't be developed without that funding. And the other really serious issue in the School of Pharmacy and elsewhere, as Dean Gladwin pointed out, is that we potentially, if we lose NIH funding and FDA funding, that is all the money that goes to train our scientists. And so as I look back over the years with my NIH funding, I've funded 15 postdocs, and 33 graduate students have gone through my lab at one level or another for PhD or master's or PharmD students learning science. And the most recent FDA funding we've had over the last few years allowed us to do 9 clinical trials for FDA. And we added that up the other day, and it ended up training about 26 different scientists in the clinical research process, in which you've heard about today, several examples of how important the clinical trial research process is here in the academic medical center. So, we really don't want to lose this funding, because then we will not have the next generation of scientists. And so I'm happy to answer any questions now or later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stinchcomb. Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Stinchcomb?
Hey, it's Fran. I have one question. I was wondering if you can tell me, I'm with Pharmacy Practice News, if you can tell me whether any of the research grants that that you were getting from NIH, did any of that, was it used for overhead in the School of Pharmacy for pharmacist training as well? Like what the impact, in addition to the impact, there being an impact on the research that you're doing and the training of postdocs and graduate students, what about at the School of Pharmacy as a whole? So does this challenge the ability to take in students of pharmacy, to train them, to give them the kinds of training that pharmacists whose roles are changing may need going forward? I wondered if you could speak to that.
Yeah, that's a very good question. We have a lot more pharmacy students interested in being industry pharmacists these days. And so they're taking jobs, especially at AstraZeneca as one of our partners. And, we need the indirect costs to pay for the infrastructure that we have. So similar in the School of Pharmacy as everywhere else, pays for, keep the lights on, and pays for safety systems and staff to keep things running. And so we need, those systems to stay in business. And what happens then, so that's the indirect cost, but then without the direct cost, the faculty aren't able to have the research projects to train the students. So that's also a big downfall. So I think all students, even if they don't go into pharmaceutical industry, are benefiting from all of the federal funding.
And just to follow up on that, the loss of grant income has also made us need to reduce the number of graduate students in the School of Medicine as well. So we really are impacting the next generation of scientists and physicians.
Thank you for that, Dr. Martin. All right. But last,
just quickly to follow up on Sarah's question before, a quick search of the NCI database shows over 7,000 active clinical trials nationwide. So you had asked the question about whether the changes in grant funding could impact trials. There are many trials sponsored by NCI that are ongoing right now.
All right. Well, waiting patiently, last but certainly not least, is Dr. Kim Mooney-Doyle. She's an associate professor of family and community medicine health at the University of Maryland School of Nursing.
Hi, thank you all for having me here today. And I'm so excited to be able to spend my afternoon with you. I'm going to share a slide just to kind of provide some context and to share some quotes from the children and parents that have participated in my research. So for a quick question, whose schedule has been thrown off when they have a child who's homesick or a family member has a health crisis? Imagine now if your child is living with a life-threatening illness, and on top of managing the appointments and the caregiving for that life-threatening illness, you're worried about your child, the impact that this has on your other kids, and you yourself are exhausted. This is the reality for the nearly 750,000 families caring for a child with a life-limiting illness in the US, as you can see from the center circle in the diagram. This experience ripples through families and their communities across time, like you can see in the surrounding circles. In my work as a nurse caring for children with cancer and rare diseases, I saw this impact. Through research funded by the National Institute of Nursing Research, we've learned that siblings and parents can experience growth, such as becoming more compassionate and tolerant, as well as challenges, such as increased post-traumatic stress, anxiety, depression, disrupted sleep, academic challenges, and changes to their family relationships. We also know that children and their families are parts of communities like school and healthcare systems that both affect and are affected by the ways families navigate this experience. Funding from the NIH, especially the National Institute of Nursing Research, to nurses, physicians, and other social scientists has been the bedrock for advances in the science of palliative care. So if you've cared for a very sick family member, you've likely benefited from this investment. I've had the really good fortune to receive funding from the National Institute of Nursing Research to take the questions and observations from my clinical experience as a peds oncology nurse and learn how to answer them through training grants to become a nurse scientist. I feel really lucky that the NINR values family research so that in my current funded work, I can learn from parents and adolescent siblings directly through conversations at their kitchen tables, in their communities, in the clinics, in the hospital, about their experiences and what they'd like their healthcare teams to do about it. Having their direct insights and partnership, we can create programs that answer my big question: what if we could help families thrive when dealing with the unfathomable? Funding this kind of research has been provided for a long time by the NIH and helps scientists like me achieve my ultimate goal of helping families live with life-threatening illnesses and injuries. When the NINR invested in my work, they invested in parents and adolescent siblings now and in future generations. Without this research, the needs of parents and adolescent siblings remain invisible, and we won't have the evidence to create sound programs that can help them adapt to the impacts of illness and that their physical and psychological distress can go unaddressed. So thank you again for your time. There are some quotes from my participants that you'll see, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, and now we also have time for general questions as well. I see all of our experts are still on, so if any of the journalists had any questions regarding any of their presentations or just general questions, I'm also happy to follow up with you afterward as well if there's any questions that we can't answer on this Zoom. So getting some nice thank yous from journalists. Thank you very much for joining. And I appreciate all the journalists who were able to join today. Thank you so much for joining and for really covering this topic in the ways that you do. I think it's just so important to get the word out there about how much we value NIH research and federally funded research in general, and how much it really impacts how our organization, academic institution operates.
And we'd be very happy to follow up with anyone who's interested.